Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
Imagine the suffocating weight of a humid Ohio evening pressing down on you like an unspoken family grudge. Your hands immersed in the relentless scrub of kitchen counters after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital where the acrid scent of industrial soap clings to your skin and evokes memories of countless patients' final struggles. And then your phone vibrates insistently with a call from your aunt whose voice fractures the mundane routine by delivering the devastating news of your grandparents' fatal car crash on that treacherous back road near their cherished farmhouse, where Grandpa Harold had veered sharply to evade a deer only for their old Chevy to collide catastrophically with an ancient oak tree, claiming both their lives in an instant without even the mercy of whispered farewells that might have offered some solace amid the ensuing chaos. As Emily Harper, a 48-year-old divorced mother who has spent years navigating the isolation of single parenthood in a modest Cleveland apartment while enduring the subtle dismissals from relatives who viewed her practical nursing career and independent spirit as somehow lesser than their pursuits of suburban success and material comforts, I found myself hurtling down the rain-slicked interstate that very night, the wipers slashing rhythmically against the downpour as fragments of recent visits replayed in my mind, including that poignant Easter gathering just 2 months prior when Grandpa had drawn me into the dimly lit garage, his calloused hands enveloping mine in a grip that conveyed unspoken urgency as he murmured about intentions to set things straight, before dismissing it with his characteristic wry chuckle. And Grandma Margaret had discreetly pressed an envelope containing cash for my daughter's impending college expenses into my palm, her eyes sparkling with a secretive warmth that now, in hindsight, hinted at depths of affection and foresight I had yet to fully comprehend. The funeral unfolded as a hazy procession of somber rituals in the small-town church with its peeling white steeple, where black attire mingled with platters of homemade casseroles in the echoing basement, and distant relatives whom I had scarcely interacted with over the years offered perfunctory embraces laced with the familiar undercurrent of condescension reserved for the family outlier who had foregone extravagant gatherings to prioritize her demanding work schedule and the quiet fulfillment derived from raising her child without relying on their intermittent financial gestures or judgmental advice. Among them loomed my brother Jack, ever the polished real estate broker with his perpetual salesman grin masking an insatiable drive for the next lucrative deal. My sister Lisa, who clutched her upscale handbag as if it were a talisman against vulnerability, while boasting of her orchestrated social calendar filled with PDA events and exclusive club affiliations, and our cousin Mike, the boisterous auto shop owner perpetually entangled in debts, yet projecting an air of unchallenged authority that grated against my more reserved demeanor, all of them exchanging glances that blended sympathy with that lingering implication of my supposed shortcomings in the grand narrative of familial achievement. The pastor's eulogy portrayed my grandparents as the quintessential hardworking couple who had transformed their modest farming roots into a substantial legacy through prudent investments in sprawling acreage and diversified stocks following Grandpa's retirement from the local steel mill, a legacy built not on ostentation, but on the steady principles they had instilled in us during those idyllic childhood summers filled with lessons on resilience and fairness that now felt ironically distant amid the gathering storm of unspoken resentments. Mere days after the burial, we convened in the confines of the lawyer's antiquated office in downtown Akron, a space redolent of aged leather and lingering coffee bitterness where diplomas hung crookedly on paneled walls and Mr. Ellis, a bespectacled septuagenarian with a meticulous demeanor honed over decades of mediating inheritances, methodically unsealed the envelope containing the meticulously drafted will that would irrevocably fracture the fragile bonds we had maintained through years of superficial civility. He began with Grandpa's preamble, the formal prose articulating profound gratitude for shared lifetimes and outlining the distribution of assets that included the sprawling farmhouse appraised at $2 million, an extensive portfolio of blue-chip stocks and government bonds amounting to $26 million more, the collection of restored vintage automobiles housed in the weathered barn, and various liquid accounts that collectively tallied an astonishing $28 million, all bequeathed exclusively to me, Emily Marie Harper, with explicit directives to steward this windfall in preservation of the enduring family ethos that my grandparents believed only I possessed the integrity to uphold without succumbing to the pitfalls of avarice they had observed eroding the resolve of others. The revelation ignited an immediate conflagration of outrage within the room, Jack's fist colliding forcefully with the arm of his chair as his complexion flushed to an alarming shade reminiscent of bruised fruit while he vociferated about his devoted caregiving during their twilight years, including the chauffeur-like errands he had undertaken when my own schedule at the hospital precluded such indulgences, Lisa dissolving into a torrent of sobs that carried more the timbre of thwarted entitlement than genuine sorrow as she lambasted me for allegedly ingratiating myself through manipulative visits, while her contributions manifested in thoughtful yet distant missives from her affluent enclave, and Mike thrusting forward with a calculating leer that betrayed his opportunistic nature as he insinuated grounds for a vigorous challenge on allegations of coercion or diminished capacity that I must have exploited in some nefarious manner to orchestrate this apparent injustice. I remained seated in stunned disbelief, the legal documents quivering slightly in my grasp as recollections surfaced of Grandma's frequent affirmations that I embodied the steadfast reliability they valued. The granddaughter who absorbed their oral histories with authentic interest rather than the perfunctory attention doled out by those whose outreach coincided suspiciously with opportunities for personal gain. Yet the barrage of their accusations reopened scars from past exclusions such as the solitary holidays I had endured due to inflexible shifts that clashed with their meticulously planned festivities, and the derisive comparisons drawn between my dependable yet unpretentious vehicle and their ostentatious fleet of luxury SUVs. As twilight descended upon the farmhouse during what was intended as a contemplative evening of sifting through personal effects to honor their memory, the simmering discord erupted into unbridled antagonism, Jack proclaiming the bequest an egregious error destined for rectification through judicial intervention, Lisa seething with declarations that familial loyalty ought to eclipse such mercenary outcomes, and in a moment of calculated cruelty, as I retreated to the porch seeking respite from the thickening tension, the resounding click of fresh tumblers engaging in the front door lock echoed through the humid air, accompanied by Mike's triumphant declaration from within that I could resort to slumbering in my automobile that evening, branded forever as the avaricious interloper who had pilfered their rightful inheritance. With my pulse accelerating amid the renewed patter of rain against the eaves, I navigated the perimeter of the house under cover of encroaching darkness, my footwear yielding to the sodden earth until I reached the familiar terracotta planter flanking the rear entrance, where, true to the contingency Grandma had confided in me during a long-ago conversation about life's unpredictabilities, the duplicate keys rested concealed, their chilled steel transferring to my palm a tangible emblem of latent reprisal and unyielding resolve. Yet as I eased through the threshold with deliberate caution to evade the telltale groans of aged floorboards, my gaze alighted upon an envelope partially obscured beneath a ledger on Grandpa's oaken desk, inscribed with my name in his tremulous script that hinted at revelations poised to append everything I thought I knew about our intertwined histories, and, before I could decipher its contents, the probing beams of approaching headlights pierced the gloom of the driveway, signaling Jack's arrival with reinforcements intent on fortifying their siege against my burgeoning claim to this unforeseen dominion. The first tentative rays of overcast dawn filtered through the lace curtains of the guest room where I had barricaded myself against the night's uncertainties. The envelope from Grandpa clutched tightly in my fist after a sleepless vigil spent deciphering its cryptic opening lines that alluded to safeguarding a concealed verity from those inclined to distort it for their own ends. Words that resonated with a foreboding clarity amid the creaks and whispers of the old farmhouse awakening to the turmoil I had unwittingly inherited alongside the staggering fortune that now positioned me as both guardian and target in this escalating familial melee. As Emily Harper, the steadfast nurse who had long mastered the art of composure amid bedside crises and the quieter battles of solitary motherhood, I rose with a resolve tempered by the sting of betrayal, brewing a pot of robust coffee in the enamel percolator that had bubbled on this very stove for generations, its familiar aroma weaving through the kitchen like a thread of continuity in the unraveling tapestry of our shared history. Before steeling myself to confront the insistent hammering on the front door that commenced precisely at 7 as if orchestrated by some vengeful alarm clock designed to amplify their indignation. Jack's voice thundered through the panels with demands for my immediate surrender and capitulation to what he deemed the natural order of inheritance. His baritone laced with the authoritative bluster of a man accustomed to closing deals on overpriced colonials, while Lisa's piercing retorts sliced the air with accusations of my insidious campaign to alienate our grandparents through calculated overtures masked as filial devotion, her tone carrying the sharp edge of one who had always navigated social hierarchies with a blend of charm and calculation, and Mike's derisive guffaws punctuated the onslaught, suggesting with crude imagery that they summoned the local authorities to evict me as the interloping pretender whose audacity knew no bounds in this sacred family bastion. Emerging onto the weathered porch in my disheveled attire from the previous day's ordeal, the duplicate keys dangling from my fingers like talismans of rightful dominion, I faced their cluster of seething figures under the slate-gray sky, their expressions morphing from aggressive certainty to bewildered frustration upon witnessing my unflinching posture that drew upon the unyielding poise cultivated through years of mediating conflicts in emergency rooms where emotions ran as high as temperatures in fevered patience, and I articulated with measured calm that the property now stood unequivocally under my stewardship as affirmed by the unassailable terms of the will, inviting them to pursue their grievances through proper legal channels rather than this theatrical blockade that bordered on harassment in the eyes of any impartial observer well-versed in property statutes. Jack advanced with a menacing swagger, his necktie askew and eyes bloodshot from what must have been a night of indignant scheming, railing against the perceived emotional extortion and reminding me of my historical role as the melodramatic sibling who had dissolved her marriage over nebulous ideals rather than pragmatic financial security. Yet I countered by brandishing my mobile device already connected to Mr. Ellis for real-time validation of the deed's transfer, an action that momentarily quelled their advance and ignited within me a spark of ingenious retaliation inspired by the cherished family traditions Grandma had woven into our summers. Those elaborate scavenger hunts disguised as innocent games that concealed lessons on equity and vigilance against opportunists lurking in familiar guises. Retrieving the dusty photo album from its shelf in the adjoining parlor, I opened it to a sepia-toned snapshot from our adolescent escapades beside the weathered barn, directing their attention to Grandpa's marginal annotation beneath the image of us children frolicking in innocent abandon, the script declaring, "Emily upholds the covenant while the rest must heed the prowling predators." A phrase that elicited a collective gasp as Lisa attempted to wrest the volume from my grasp only for me to reclaim it with a sardonic arch of my brow, proposing that should they persist in this belligerent farce, I would disseminate this emblem of long-standing partiality across our extended kin at the forthcoming memorial luncheon, transforming their avaricious pursuits into the fodder for county-wide speculation that would tarnish their veneers of respectability far more enduringly than any courtroom verdict. This verbal parry, delivered with the wry understatement of one who had endured their barbs for decades without retaliation, procured a fragile truce as they withdrew to their gleaming vehicles amid grumbled vows of litigation and estrangement, their departure leaving me to secure the entrance with a resounding turn of the bolt that echoed my burgeoning autonomy, though the solitude amplified the gravity of Grandpa's missive, which I unfolded anew in the sun-dappled living room, its contents unfurling a narrative of observed inequities and how they had marginalized me through my uncomplaining sacrifices, such as foregoing vacations to cover medical bills or attending graduations alone while they reveled in collective splendor. Yet the letter hinted at layers beyond mere favoritism, alluding to a concealed facet of the estate's origins that could dismantle their facades if prematurely exposed. A revelation that twisted my gut with inquiries into the shadowy motivations behind their deliberate exclusion and the true scope of loyalties fractured long before the crash's tragic finality. As the morning progressed into a deceptive calm broken only by the distant hum of harvest machinery in adjacent fields, I immersed myself in organizing the den's cluttered drawers, unearthing amid faded Receipts and correspondence, a notarized codicil dated mere weeks prior to the accident, its clauses reinforcing my sole executorship while obliquely referencing assets derived from rectified past oversights. That piqued my curiosity about potential skeletons in the familial closet, but before I could probe further into this tantalizing document, my telephone erupted with an unidentified caller whose terse intonation announced the initiation of a preliminary injunction by my kin to sequester the holdings on suspicions of impropriety, culminating in the dispatch of uniformed personnel slated to arrive within the hour to enforce my ouster from what they now framed as contested terrain. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of the approaching patrol vehicle whose unlit emergency beacons and muted engine conveyed an aura of procedural inevitability rather than dramatic intervention, prompting me to position myself at the threshold of the farmhouse with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and the freshly printed and notarized copy of the will in the other. My pulse quickening not from trepidation but from the anticipatory surge of leveraging institutional authority to invert the power dynamics that my relatives had so aggressively asserted since the reading of the bequest, which had transformed our collective mourning into a battlefield of avarice and recrimination. As Emily Harper, the 48-year-old veteran of high-stakes medical emergencies, where split-second decisions often delineated life from loss, I greeted officers Ramirez and Klein with the composed professionalism that had served me through countless shifts in the chaotic corridors of Cleveland General Hospital, extending the beverage as a gesture of Midwestern hospitality while succinctly outlining the sequence of events from the unauthorized lock change to the harassing confrontation that morning. Their attentive nods and occasional queries revealing a familiarity with similar disputes born from decades patrolling the rural fringes of Summit County, where family estates frequently ignited feuds as incendiary as summer brush fires. Ramirez, a sturdy figure in his mid-50s with a salt-and-pepper mustache framing a face etched by years of mediating neighborly skirmishes and domestic upheavals, perused the legal documents with a practiced eye before affirming through a radio check with dispatch that no active warrants or conflicting claims appeared on record, while Klein, his younger counterpart whose build suggested a background in collegiate wrestling and whose demeanor carried the pragmatic skepticism of one who had witnessed the erosion of sibling bonds over far less than $28 million, elaborated on the pertinent Ohio statutes governing inheritance possession that rendered the property inviolably mine pending any formal adjudication, their presence alone serving as a bulwark against the impending arrival of my kin whose vehicles soon materialized in a discordant parade, tires spitting pebbles as they disgorged Jack, Lisa, and Mike in a tableau of contrived outrage designed to sway the uniformed arbiters toward their narrative of victimhood. Jack led the charge with a sheaf of hastily acquired paperwork from an online legal template service, his voice booming with assertions of my unlawful occupation and emotional duress inflicted upon the grieving survivors who had stewarded the homestead through the grandparents' infirmities while I allegedly prioritized my menial vocation over substantive involvement. Lisa amplifying the performance with theatrical sniffles and invocations of equitable distribution rooted in decades of presumed entitlement, her manicured fingers clutching a handkerchief that absorbed more pretense than tears, and Mike looming with crossed arms and a scowl that belied his underlying unease at the prospect of law enforcement scrutinizing his own checkered financial history involving unpaid liens on his garage business. Yet Ramirez interposed with authoritative restraint, reciting the codified protections that shielded legatees from extralegal evictions and cautioning that tampering with secured premises could escalate to misdemeanor charges if pursued further without judicial backing. A pronouncement that hung in the crisp autumn air like a verdict, prompting a stunned hush among my accusers whose faces registered the dawning realization of their tactical miscalculation in summoning authorities who now validated my tenure rather than facilitating their expulsion. Seizing the opportunity for a modicum of retribution infused with the dry wit that had sustained me through family dinners laced with passive-aggressive jabs, I extended a newly minted duplicate key toward Mike with an arched eyebrow and a quip about his penchant for nocturnal entries suggesting he might appreciate a legitimate means of access next time he felt compelled to play the uninvited guest. The officer's subdued chuckles underscoring the absurdity of his posturing and eliciting a flush of embarrassment that rendered his bluster impotent as he recoiled from the proffered metal as if it burned, the moment crystallizing. My shift from defensive survivor to strategic counterplayer in this inheritance imbroglio that viewers might critique as overly confrontational, yet which felt cathartically necessary after years of being sidelined in familial deliberations. With their retreat marked by muttered imprecations and slammed car doors echoing across the yard, the deputies departed after advising me to document any subsequent intrusions, leaving me to the introspective quiet of the attic where shafts have diffused. Sunlight illuminated cobweb-draped relics of bygone eras, and as I sifted through trunks brimming with ephemera from our collective youth, my fingers unearthed a tarnished black-and-white photograph slipped between the pages of a family Bible whose brittle leaves chronicled baptisms and unions predating my birth. The image capturing Grandma in her 20s radiant beside an unidentified gentleman whose features bore an uncanny resemblance to distant kin, the reverse bearing her looping cursive notation dated to the eve of her marriage to Grandpa about the decision that preserved our harmony yet exacted a toll on Emily's tranquility. A cryptic allusion that ignited a cascade of conjectures regarding potential indiscretions or relinquished lineages that could elucidate the preferential bequest and the grandparents' guarded whispers during my visits about legacies unmarred by past indiscretions. This discovery stirred a tumult of emotions, compelling me to question whether my inheritance stemmed from mere affinity or a deeper entanglement in unresolved familial enigmas that positioned me as unwitting custodian of truths capable of further alienating those already estranged. A dilemma that resonated with the audience's own experiences of hidden histories surfacing at inopportune junctures to challenge perceptions of kinship and equity. Yet the fragile peace shattered with the insistent chime of the doorbell heralding a courier in nondescript attire bearing a manila envelope emblazoned with the county clerk's seal. Its contents comprising a formal complaint lodged by my siblings and cousin alleging not only undue influence, but outright fabrication of testamentary instruments, accompanied by Lisa's notarized affidavit fabricating scenarios of my coercive interactions with Grandpa in his waning vitality, a fabrication so brazen it propelled me toward the telephone to rally Mr. Ellis for an immediate counteroffensive while the specter of protracted litigation loomed, threatening to ensnare the estate in bureaucratic tendrils that could delay access to the funds earmarked for my daughter's aspirations and my own hard-won stability. The days following the delivery of those incendiary court summonses dissolved into a frenetic haze of legal consultations and archival dives that transformed the farmhouse's sunlit study into a warren of stacked folders and flickering laptop screens, where I pored over precedents and affidavits until the wee hours, my eyes straining against the glow while the weight of impending litigation pressed upon me like the humid blanket of an Ohio summer night, compelling reflections on how this unforeseen bounty had morphed from a beacon of security into a vortex threatening to engulf not only my hard-earned independence, but also the fragile aspirations I'd harbored for my daughter's unencumbered path forward in a world that had already exacted its tolls through divorce decrees and solitary parent-teacher conferences. As Emily Harper, the resilient nurse whose career had equipped her with the fortitude to navigate bureaucratic labyrinths from insurance claims to ethical dilemmas in patient care, I collaborated closely with Mr. Ellis in his cluttered Akron office adorned with brass nameplates and shelves groaning under the burden of leather-bound tomes, dissecting the adversary's allegations of fabricated documents and undue sway with a precision that uncovered their overreach, including discrepancies in Lisa's perjured declaration that contradicted her own calendar entries showing sporadic visits at best while I had clocked consistent hours tending to the grandparents' daily needs amid my rotating shifts. The pretrial conference unfolded in the imposing edifice of the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, a monolithic structure of polished granite and echoing corridors that evoked the solemnity of historical reckonings, where I arrived fortified by a thermos of black coffee and the sartorial armor of a tailored blazer borrowed from a colleague, navigating the throngs of litigants and their counsel with the determined stride of one reclaiming agency after years of peripheral existence in family narratives dominated by louder voices and loftier ambitions. Judge Harlan, a formidable jurist in her early 60s whose silver-streaked coiffure and piercing gaze commanded immediate respect from the assembled parties, presided over the preliminary hearing with an efficiency born of countless similar sagas. Her gavel's rap silencing the preliminary flourishes as Hargrove, the opposing attorney with his slicked-back hair and pinstripe suit exuding the sleaze of a used-car salesman peddling dubious warranties, launched into a diatribe portraying me as the Machiavellian manipulator who had preyed upon the elder's frailties during vulnerable interludes, citing fabricated anecdotes of whispered persuasions in the dim confines of the sick room, while my siblings ostensibly shouldered the burdens of long-term support. Yet Mr. Ellis countered with evidentiary artillery, meticulously assembled from notarized logs of my caregiving contributions, email trails, exposing Jack's requests for financial infusions from the estate during the grandparents' lifetime that smacked of self-interest rather than altruism, and most damningly, a digital archive of Lisa's social media boasts about her jet-set lifestyle juxtaposed against my grounded routine, a juxtaposition that Hargrove attempted to dismiss as circumstantial yet which the judge scrutinized with evident skepticism, her notations suggesting an inclination toward dismissing the motion as baseless. Harassment. In a pivotal exchange under oath, as Hargrove pressed me on the veracity of my relationship with the deceased, I responded with the understated candor that had disarmed many a skeptical superior in my professional life, conceding that while I lacked their flair for performative affection, my bonds were forged in authentic exchanges, such as the late-night discussions with Grandpa about market fluctuations and Grandma's herbal remedies shared over cooling tea, a testimony that resonated with the courtroom's diverse observers who nodded in recognition of the quiet devotions often overshadowed by ostentatious displays in the theater of familial duty. The crowning stroke of reprisal materialized when Ellis projected onto the screen a chain of intercepted texts among my relatives, wherein Mike had crudely outlined a scheme to fabricate witness testimonies in exchange for shares of any overturned windfall, the revelation eliciting gasps from the gallery and a visible pallor overtaking Mike's features as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the public unmasking of his venal machinations serving as my ingenious humiliation that not only undermined their credibility but also invited murmurs of condemnation from extended kin present as character witnesses, their whispers amplifying the sting far beyond the legal confines and etching indelible marks on reputations painstakingly curated through community involvements and professional networks. Though the judge recessed with a stern admonition against further dilatory tactics and hints at potential sanctions to deter such frivolity, the victory felt bittersweet amid the undercurrent of sorrow for the brother whose boyhood alliances in backyard adventures now seemed irretrievably severed by this chasm of cupidity, prompting a momentary introspection on whether my unyielding stance exacerbated the isolation that had defined my adulthood, choices that might strike observers as vindictive when tempered empathy could have preserved slivers of reconciliation in the wake of irreplaceable losses. Returning to the farmhouse under a canopy of brooding clouds that mirrored the tempest within, I channeled the day's adrenaline into further explorations of the attic's trove, where a brass-bound diary secured by a rusted clasp yielded to the slender key pilfered from Grandma's vanity, its pages chronicling entries from the mid-century era that alluded to the relinquished heir whose shadow lingers in Emily's features, passages laced with remorse over a clandestine adoption arranged to cloak a relative's youthful indiscretion, suggesting that the amassed wealth partially originated from strategic acquisitions funded by settlements to maintain silence on this buried lineage. A disclosure that reframed my inheritance as restitution for generational oversights and ignited quandaries about my own biological moorings within this convoluted web. As evening deepened into obscurity, the satisfaction of the courtroom triumph waned against the gnawing uncertainties of these unearthed intimacies, but tranquility fractured with the unmistakable shatter of glass reverberating from the rear veranda, accompanied by the scuffle of footsteps on the Duquesne lawn, thrusting me into vigilant alertness as I grasped the cordless phone and scanned the darkness for signs of the intruders whose desperation had evidently transcended legal boundaries into realms of perilous intrusion. The piercing wail of sirens cleaved through the velvet shroud of midnight enveloping the farmhouse, their oscillating lights painting erratic crimson and azure patterns across the dew-laden grass as I peered from the casement window with the cordless telephone pressed to my ear in mid-dial to emergency services. The acrid tang of adrenaline sharpening my senses while the intruder's hasty retreat scattered shadows among the skeletal outlines of the orchard trees, their aborted incursion leaving. Behind a shattered pane of the French doors and Mike's distinctive monogrammed wrench glinting accusingly on the flagstone terrace, like a discarded confession amid the chaos of this nocturnal assault that marked the nadir of their escalating vendetta against my custodianship of the inheritance they coveted with a fervor bordering on mania. As Emily Harper, the unyielding matriarch whose life had been a mosaic of calculated risks from navigating the perils of solo parenting to defusing tensions in overcrowded ER bays, I relayed the details to the arriving deputies with the clinical detachment of one recounting a trauma case, illuminating the circumstantial evidence that implicated Mike in this felonious foray driven by the sting of the courtroom rebuff where their lawsuit had crumbled under the weight of exposed deceptions. The officers' flashlights sweeping the perimeter to secure the scene and dispatch a unit to apprehend the perpetrator whose flight path led inexorably back to his cluttered workshop on the town's outskirts. Dawn's pallid light heralded a temporary reprieve secured by the issuance of a protective order that barred my antagonists from the premises under penalty of arrest, prompting me to orchestrate a conclave on neutral territory at the venerable roadside diner where Grandpa had regaled us with tales of his mill days over platters of greasy spoon classics and bottomless mugs of diner brew, the vinyl-upholstered booth in the rear corner offering a semblance of the impartial ground we had forsaken in the throes of this avaricious strife. They materialized at staggered intervals under the diner's neon glow, Jack arriving with the haggard aspect of a man whose real estate empire teetered on the brink of insolvency without the anticipated bailout, Lisa trailing with mascara-streaked cheeks that betrayed a vulnerability cracking her facade of poised entitlement, and Mike slinking in last with bandaged knuckles and averted eyes that spoke volumes of his nocturnal misadventure. The four of us crammed into the confines where the sizzle of hash browns and murmur of truckers provided a mundane counterpoint to the seismic undercurrents of unresolved grievances and half-buried truths. Initiating the discourse with the gravitas of a mediator closing a contentious shift report, I arrayed upon the Formica tabletop the dossier of revelations amassed from attic forays and legal skirmishes, encompassing the incriminating texts, the enigmatic photograph of Grandma's enigmatic suitor, and excerpts from the diary chronicling a mid-century relinquishment shrouded in familial expediency, articulating how their rapacious maneuvers had transmuted collective bereavement into a maelstrom of perfidy that eroded the very foundations Grandpa and Grandma had labored to fortify through prudent accumulations and whispered confidences about equity's true measure. For the capstone of reprisal, I proffered a proposition laced with the ironic levity that had armored me against their barbs across decades of holiday toasts and birthday barbs, stipulating a division of $1 million apiece in exchange for irrevocable cessation of hostilities and a vow of perpetual disengagement, or, alternatively, the dissemination of this compendium to the local gazette and our sprawling network of cousins whose judgments would flay their pretensions more acutely than any judicial fine, a gambit that elicited a spectrum of reactions from Jack's indignant sputters about moral imperatives to Lisa's choked admissions of overlooked sacrifices and Mike's sullen grunts, conceding the folly of his impulsive escapade. The fulcrum of the exchange pivoted on the partial unveiling of the legacy's arcane provenance, wherein I disclosed that the fortune's bedrock included parcels acquired through discreet indemnities to silence echoes of an illicit liaison resulting in a surrendered infant whose likeness to my own countenance hinted at entanglements transcending mere favoritism. A disclosure that fractured Lisa's composure as fragmented recollections of maternal anecdotes about lost branches coalesced into a mosaic implicating our lineage in deceptions that positioned me as inadvertent beneficiary of atonement for sins not my own, yet I withheld the diary's conclusive passages that might affirm or refute biological ties, preserving an aura of ambiguity that compelled them to confront the hollowness of their claims amid the diner's banal symphony. As they dispersed into the broadening daylight, each departure laden with the residue of shattered illusions and tentative acceptances of the proffered settlement, I lingered amid the cooling dregs of my coffee. The $28 million manifesting as a Pyrrhic emblem of emancipation that illuminated pathways for philanthropic endeavors and my daughter's scholastic pursuits, yet cast long shadows of solitude over the hollowed halls of the farmhouse now bereft of their contentious presences. In the ensuing quietude, the unanswered riddles proliferated, whether my inheritance bespoke unassailable loyalty or veiled culpability in ancestral concealments. If severing these tainted bonds heralded genuine renewal or merely entrenched a profound estrangement that mirrored the grandparents' own guarded isolations, queries that lingered like the faint scent of pipe tobacco in Grandpa's study, inviting contemplation on the elusive essence of family when trust dissolves into the ether of unspoken legacies and the pursuit of justice exacts unforeseen tolls upon the victor's spirit.